This week on the Backtable Podcast.
We weren't like drinking buddies who sat around saying, hey, let's start a company together. You know, there was a real genesis and impetus to doing this that drove it forward. And the downside, I think, of knowing somebody socially before getting them involved in something that is so, important and involves so much sacrifice is that you don't necessarily know whether you can criticize them and still be able to have dinner and drinks with them later on, right? Mm-hmm. You know, so I would say that that's also something to consider, that, just the character of the individuals involved is a key aspect of success.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Backtable Innovation Podcast. You can find all previous episodes of our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and of course on backtable.com. This is our next installment in the Backtable Innovation Show, where you're going to hear stories from physician entrepreneurs who are helping to drive healthcare forward through medtech innovation. This is Bryan Hartley as your host this week. I'm a radiologist living in Nashville and co-founder of an early-stage imaging company in the pulmonary space. I'm very excited to introduce our special guests this week, Dr. Dan Vander Weide and Dr. Fred Lee. Dr. Vander Weide is a professor of electrical and computer engineering at the University of Wisconsin. He's an inventor as well as a serial entrepreneur. His research focuses on microwave energy and applications, which led him to co-found Neuwave Medical along with Dr. Fred Lee, which was acquired by J&J in around 2016. He's also the founder of several other companies, including Optometra, acquired by Tektronix in 2010. Dr. Fred Lee is an interventional radiologist at the University of Wisconsin. We had him on recently. He's a world-renowned researcher, innovator, and successful entrepreneur as well. He's the founder of 3 venture-backed startup companies with a successful exit of Neuwave to J&J. Both Fred and Dan are now co-founders of Elucent Medical with the Invisio navigation system with SmartClip for accurate tumor localization during cancer surgery. With that, Dan, welcome to the show, and Fred, welcome back.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you for having us, Brian.
Yeah, it's great to have you guys on together. This is the first time we're kind of doing both of 2 guests on at the same time, so we'll see how it works. Be patient. But I'm going to just tell a little bit where we ended, Fred. So we're in the story, the genesis of Neuwave, and we heard a little bit about you, Fred, at the beginning, your history, how it led you to ablation, and then how you got to Dan and started Neuwave. We're dividing that up into a 3-part story, and this is part 2. So at the end of last show, we had Fred on telling us his path to ablation. We ended when you met Dan, and you guys had rapid prototyped a microwave antenna using waveguides and apparently a microwave on popcorn setting. And tested it on pig livers, and it worked. You said it was the best ablation zone you'd seen yet. Then you guys decided to make a company, especially after an attorney from a strategic told you that, and I quote or paraphrase, he would roll over in his grave if you were ever able to do anything commercial with this. And you took that to heart. And I want to know what happened next, guys. So please take the floor and let's get rolling.
Well, Dan, I think you better start.
Well, I think what you want for innovation in part is not to be contaminated with the way it's always been done. That can really narrow your focus and, prevent you from seeing the picture from a fundamental perspective. And, as academics, I think one of the things that we constantly try to cultivate in our research as well as in our teaching is a firm grasp of the fundamentals. And I think that kind of thinking and that practice also extends beyond, the science and the engineering, and extends into how to approach life in a startup, to be thinking about the fundamentals, not getting overly caught up in the trappings, whether current or expected, of success. I think one of the hallmarks of many successful and serial entrepreneurs is a focus on making sure that the investors and the stakeholders, whoever they are getting their due, and not that I get to drive a Ferrari. I think that too much focus on the appearance of success can undermine your success in real terms, in part because you may end up making decisions based, at least in part, on how is this going to look to the outside world? And are people going to talk if I sell my house in a nice neighborhood and move to a much more humble structure in order to make this go? I have never really been that concerned, as Fred will testify. I haven't been super concerned with, whether I'm wearing matching clothes or my hair is perfectly combed. I'm getting better.
You've got the mad scientist look. I don't know. We talked about Doc Brown before from Back to the Future,
Yeah.
So that was the
I've been
picture.
known to show up at board meetings with messy hair. Let's put it that way.
Well, it's with brilliance, right? That's what comes. So tell me, I just want to go back to that thesis defense, and Fred had been thinking about microwave almost his entire life at this point. Okay, he's been working with Dieter, and they're trying to solve these problems. And then when you saw the thesis defense, I just want to know, was it obvious to you that microwave would be better? Was it just like, what are these guys doing type of situation? What were your thoughts when you saw that?
Well, my thoughts were that it seemed barbaric to run current through a patient, to have to paralyze the patient so that they wouldn't respond when being effectively electrocuted.
So you were thinking about the patient well-being, or were you thinking from just an efficacy standpoint that a burn could be much more controlled with microwave?
All of the above.
Okay.
And Bryan, maybe one comment too is that, we had been pretty focused on radiofrequency ablation for many years. And I told you that my only contribution was just an incremental improvement in current radiofrequency devices. But I think that Dan, as he mentioned before, thought about the problem more as a fundamental problem about just making an ablation zone with whatever. And his broad-based understanding of energy writ large was something that someone like me just couldn't have. I mean, I was so focused on a specific device and a specific improvement for a device. That was as far as I could take it, because as Dan mentioned, I had no fundamental knowledge of how energy and tissue interacted, but Dan came from the very opposite perspective, where he knew everything about that and wasn't as aware of the clinical devices and the current limitations as I was. I think that's part of the reason why we make such a good team.
I think that really highlights the complementarity that was extremely important to the success of the project, because it's very difficult, I think, for a physician to be as fully informed of all the fundamental physics going into the use of different types of energy for different types of purposes. And I think there's a certain amount of ego that accompanies anybody who is accomplished in a given area. So managing that ego and knowing the limits of my knowledge, and being, as Fred has said earlier, being humble enough to simply listen and perhaps consider that I may not know the full scope of the application or the limitations. That's so important, especially, for example, Fred was keenly aware of the clinical limitations of the current practice. And, for me, not being aware of those limitations was actually beneficial. I think subsequently, with the start of Elucent, for example, again, Fred mentioned some clinical limitations with regard to placement of a hook wire that to me, again, sounded barbaric. And it was kind of, Neuwave 2.0. It's like, why not do it this way as opposed to that way? And so I think that having the sort of childlike wonder that Fred has about, wow, this looks really bad. I don't know what we can do about it, rather than presuming that, there's necessarily a solution that's just around the corner. Talking to somebody else with a completely different perspective is often where the magic happens.
And that's okay. That just needs to be highlighted. I think that's where I was going with this is, somebody out there, if you have a clinical need, a problem you're trying to solve, somebody out there has a solution. I mean, there's no problem on earth that I imagine could not be solved if you had the right people. And so it makes sense. I mean, Fred went to the thesis defense and, his ears were up. He was open for new opportunities and to meeting new people who might have solutions like yourself. And so you guys had a conversation, you did some initial prototyping, and then when did you have the conversation about starting a company? I mean, I assume you two didn't know each other before that time.
We knew each other because we were living in the same neighborhood and our kids were going to the same elementary school, but it wasn't.
That's right.
It wasn't anything.
You weren't like best friends or anything. No, you didn't.
Really just, I think, the genesis of Neuwave was, also the genesis of just a very productive, collaborative relationship and friendship. But,
incredible.
I also have been thinking about this too, is, and we'll probably touch on this going forward, but being friends with someone, let's say prior to getting involved with them in a business sense, is also a double-edged sword. And I'm not sure that would characterize the relationship that Fred and I have had, because I think that we weren't like drinking buddies who sat around saying, "Hey, let's start a company together." There was a real genesis and impetus to doing this that drove it forward. And the downside, I think, of knowing somebody socially
beforehand,
before getting them involved in something that is so important and involves so much sacrifice, is that you don't necessarily know whether you can criticize them and still be able to have dinner and drinks with them later on, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that that's also something to consider, that, just the character of the individuals involved is a key aspect of success.
Basically, there's a difference between social friends and founder friends. And I hate to say it, from what I've seen, founder friends requires a level of trust and just belief and commitment that is on a different level. Having experienced it here, you put your whole faith in that person, and not only that, financially, that's something that never really comes into not often to a social friendship, is like, we're both going to commit a significant financial risk here because we believe in each other. And that's a big commitment. It's like marriage. I want to say that it's like marriage.
It's an apt analogy.
So tell us about that. Yeah, both of y'all.
So Bryan, I was just going to say that I think Dan accurately characterizes how we got to know each other, and it's one of those things where if the business relationship and the academic relationship really preceded our friendship, and we started to realize over time, and I would include Laura in this too, is that we had skill sets that were very complementary. Our personalities, I think, are very complementary. And over time, we just realized that I can trust this person with anything. And I'd just add one extra anecdote is that, and Dan will tell the story about how the company actually got started and some of the financial risks we took, which were pretty substantial. But after the dust cleared and Neuwave had exited, Dan and I got together and we, with the university, we made a professorship, and we funded it, the two of us, as well as some other donors at the university. And, the professorship, we wanted to make it to kind of memorialize, in Dan's words, the complementary nature of radiology and engineering. And so
totally.
we haven't given it to anybody yet, but it's essentially fully funded. But there's two things that really struck me about that. First, that Dan and I made equal contributions to the professorship. And then when we decided, well, what are we going to name this? And the chairs of the departments were asking us about what we're going to name it. Dan is the one that said, we're going to name it after your father.
Wow.
And to me, I'm thinking to myself, wow, what a financial sacrifice Dan just made. What a personal sacrifice he's made over many years to make our company go. And then to be so generous and to not even think about it and to be celebrating this, even though it's named after my father. I mean, that is something that was just special and you just don't see very often. And that was one of the moments of many that I felt like, okay, I made the right choice in partners.
Yeah, it's very clear to me. I mean, you take ego out of it because there's so much ego involved, and I think, Dan, you're probably going to talk a little bit about that, I hope. But it's finding people who are so experienced and humble, and that is the perfect combination, because those people generally want to find the right answer, not want to be right. And that's something when we were at Stanford Biodesign we talked about all the time. You'd start arguing about something, and you're like, wait a minute. Am I arguing because I want to be right, or am I arguing because I want to find the right answer? And those are two very different things, and you can often spot them if you really look close enough. And so it's so important to have people who are looking for the right answer.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes, the people aren't right. And Dan, maybe tell this story about one or two individuals that weren't right in the company. And it's really hard, especially, Bryan, as you're saying at the beginning of a company, you're so small and there's just a few of you, and you have to make a really, really hard decision that somebody's just not right for the team. And, well, Dan, you should tell the story because you really are the one that saved us.
Is this before or after you guys, because it sounds like you guys self-funded a little bit, or not a little bit, you self-funded early on. Was this before? Did you self-fund and then hire people that didn't end up working out, or bring on partners? I want to know what skin in the game you had when these conflicts happen, I guess is why I'm bringing this up.
Yeah, we self-funded to be able to hire our first full-time employee, Matt Thiel, and the location of the company was initially in some leased space that I had in an adjacent community to Madison called Middleton. And it was pretty nice office space that was light industrial and made us look bigger than we actually were. And that's always, useful for appearance's sake. And we were able to create, an environment that I think was inviting for our initial employees. And yet we were also keenly aware that in order for us to take it to the next level, we definitely needed some outside financing.
And did you guys, and I know Fred had mentioned mortgaging a house. Is that something that, is that where when you did this, is kind of at the beginning, or was that later?
I definitely was making somewhat painful contributions, but as is often the case, when I'm starting a company with a partner, there's an understanding that, I'm writing a check and you're writing a check. And, you can say all you want about how money might not be the most important thing, but it certainly is an indicator, and the willingness to, expend those resources toward a common goal sends a powerful signal about, anybody's, commitment to the overall enterprise.
Mm-hmm. To investors and to each other.
To each other. And, I think, if you're not committed to each other and to the vision, investors are not naive. They'll be able to see through that. So I think all of this kind of rolls together. And I think it's important to bring out some subtleties. We were talking about ego earlier. Anybody who knows me, especially, when I get student evaluations, I get certain student evaluations that are pretty harsh. And actually, they're a little bit painful to read because, they highlight how I can be kind of imperious and condescending to certain students, and I certainly don't mean to be that way. But I also don't have a lot of time to get the points across, and so I'm not babysitting. So I can come across as pretty matter of fact, and I've had an attorney friend of mine describe me as being intense.
Mm-hmm. Hey, sometimes you need intensity for a startup.
It's sort of like a fish in water. I don't see that. It just looks like water to me. But I will fully, accept that if somebody thinks that I can be intense to the point of condescending, that may be an opinion you can hold, and maybe it reflects a little bit more on you than it does on me, but whatever.
Yeah.
Fortunately, Fred is somebody who is not put off by, whatever personality quirks I might have. And
well, tell us about those. Tell us how your personality and maybe others on the team didn't mesh. It sounds like you guys funded, you had a lot of skin in the game. And where did things maybe try to go off the rails a little bit?
Well, I'm thinking in particular about our initial sort of business person who we got involved, and I would harken back to my earlier comments about friendships kind of informing the decisions that were made, and I think Fred, you might have a few words to say about how that may have influenced your selection of this individual. If you want to say a few words before we launch into it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and Bryan, this is like, as you listen to this, you're going to be saying like, what is the matter with these guys? They should have seen this from 100 miles away, but just didn't. And
no, that's how startups are. You don't know until the problem's so obvious in your rearview mirror. You're like, wow, why didn't we see that? And everybody else sees it, but maybe you don't. Yeah.
And in retrospect, it's obvious, but at the time it's sometimes not so obvious. And so what Dan is referring to is that, I'm a doctor and I never thought that I would be involved with business ever. I mean, Dan is a little bit more evolved thinker in terms of business and has had some experience in the past before, but I just never did. And, and I know, Bryan, you can really relate to this when I say that when you think about business people, quote unquote, they all seem the same. It's like they must have gone to business school and they must have learned how to do this and they must learn how to do that. Just like people think about doctors and are a little bit surprised that I might not know very much about neurosurgery, for example. Yeah. It's
there's definitely a whole subspecialties that I don't know anything about.
That's exactly right. And just as much as we have subspecialization in medicine, there is subspecialization in business. And frankly, I did not appreciate that very well.
Yep.
What Dan is referring to is that I had a friend whose wife was involved in retail at a fairly high level in business with a well-known company and had recently moved to Madison. And I thought to myself, hey, this is perfect serendipity. This is somebody that has a lot of business experience that can help us get going in a startup. And on the face of it, seemed pretty decent. I mean, this person had a resume that was very impressive, but it was mostly in the retail side. But for me, I didn't know that there was any difference between startup and retail. It's all business, And Dan was a little bit more nervous about it, but said, let's kind of give it a shot. And at the beginning, things went fairly well. As you said, you're in that honeymoon phase and there's some excitement and things. And then up into the point where it didn't. And I'll let Dan take it from there and maybe describe when the wheels sort of started falling off, when we started looking for outside funding and that sort of thing, when we were trying to move from bootstrapping into a real company?
Yeah. So I think that, without being able to unearth all the details, I'd just like to cover it at more of the anecdotal, high level, conceptual level, because here we are trying to develop the probe, the needle, and the power source. We've got Matt Thiel working full time on on the engineering side of things, as well as from a complementary perspective. Fred's already mentioned Paul and Chris, essentially his student and my student, who have also gone on to be extremely successful in their careers, working on the academic exploration of this stuff. And just as a side note, but one that I want to docket for later discussion, is the way we handled the IP. I think is something that I'm proud of, even though it required swallowing hard at the time to make that decision. But we didn't develop this under any federal support. And as such, at the University of Wisconsin, the policy is that, even though you disclose such an invention, you are not obligated to, turn the title over to the university. Assign it, right. And that's a unique situation and one of the attractive aspects of being here. But nonetheless, we did choose to assign it to WARF. And then
what is WARF?
WARF stands for the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation. You've probably heard of warfarin, which is Coumadin.
Yes, Fred spoke about this on the last show. That's right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, WARF operates at arm's length from the university, but is effectively the IP processing and licensing arm of University of Wisconsin. And so we brought the invention to them and then turned around and had to license it. So, sort of like taking your kid and adopting it out and then readopting your kid at a price. And I think that decision was one of many where we chose the high road and never looked back, but always appreciated the kind of political advantages that accrued to that decision in terms of, we did something we didn't have to do. And the fact that both Fred and I were in agreement about something like this, even though it required shelling out many tens of thousands of dollars in order to license that patent, we nonetheless did it. Now, people might sit there and say to themselves, why would you do something as foolish as that? I mean, you're taking your seed corn and you're basically, giving it to somebody who's not producing value immediately for the company. But in a long-term way, it eventually paid off for us, not only in terms of goodwill, but also in terms of, WARF eventually became an investor in the company. So, and has subsequently been an investor in our other companies. So we built, really good relationships by making a hard choice up front. So I mentioned that only in terms of having to be on the same side when we make difficult decisions. Another decision that we had to face fairly early on, while we were still embryonic, and certainly I think before we got our first A round of funding, was that we were approached by a large medical device company who was aware of what we were doing. And, Fred, you'll remember this. We were offered roughly $1 million for what it was at the time, the status of the device and of the system.
It was more than that, but
more than that. But it's something that sounds like a lot of money, but doesn't necessarily reflect where we think it's going to go.
Right.
At the time, we hadn't really solved the cooling issue, so there were things that still needed to be solved, but it was starting to look more and more promising. And Fred and I and the others on the team, to a lesser extent, had to look at each other and say, no, we're not going to take this. We're not going to take the short-term buyout. We're going to do, we're in this for the long haul. And I'm extremely proud of that decision that we made, and more importantly, the way that we made the decision, and the teamwork and shared sacrifice that went into making that decision, because I think it was really born of pure belief in the future of the company, and not influenced by, short-term needs. I mean, it would have been really nice to have a little extra cash in each one of our pockets at that time. Things were fairly lean, but we decided against it because we believed in the future of the company. So I'm trying to set the stage for how, at critical junctions and decision points in the company's early lifetime, we collectively made decisions that had almost no, at least in my memory, almost no dispute about them. It's like, yeah, we're going to do this, right? Or we're not going to do this, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And there wasn't a lot of back and forth where we ended up on opposite sides of the decision. So, despite having discussed earlier in our talks about team conflicts, I think the nucleus of the team has always been very consistent in its values and the decisions that arise from those. So given that, now let's talk about specifically our growing sort of discomfort with the approach of somebody who comes from an executive position in retail.
Sure.
And is trying to manage a startup, and the business side of the startup, and perhaps aspiring to be someone, and aspiring to become a name, and aspiring to be known as somebody who's a founder and part of this very important thing, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, are there some unmet ego needs there that are behind the scenes?
Well, maybe you can dive into what was going on. Where were the specific conflicts with this?
Okay, and I'm just setting the stage, but what was going on is we're trying to raise capital from either angels, and we spoke to a few, and one in particular who was very interested in financing us, and a local venture firm, venture investors, and in particular one of their partners, Scott Button, with whom I'd had a long relationship anyway. So he and I, Scott was a mechanical engineering graduate of the University of Wisconsin. So, had a lot of interest in what was going on. And I had taught a course called Business for Engineers, which was kind of an outgrowth of an experience that I had doing the same thing at Stanford when I was a grad student there. So I had Scott be one of our speakers in my Business for Engineers course. And so Scott was, I think, always interested in what Dan was doing. And so, I remember we brought Scott in to kind of explain to him what we were about and what we were trying to accomplish. And, just showing kind of a tabletop demo of, the applicator, maybe some ideas that we were working on with regard to the power source. And I think Fred may have mentioned earlier that, this isn't enough to give somebody who's well outside the field the overall picture and let them fill in all the blanks in their imagination for how this could look in clinical practice. These are just a bunch of parts on the table. So without going to a full-scale prototype, complete with the operating table and the mannequin and drapes and things that we ended up setting up in this office building that I had been leasing, without enabling that kind of vision, we weren't getting anywhere. And until we did that, we actually swallowed hard. We said, you know what? Even though we understand this, we're going to have to make it ultra explicit for the potential, VCs. And so we went out and got a mannequin, we got a table, we draped it up. We basically just mocked up a whole OR in order to show them this is the vision. This is what we're going to do. And, you might think, oh, that's kind of hokey. Why did you have to do that? It made a huge difference. It was just one of those things that I think goes also to show the prospective, sources of capital that you are serious, and that you're going to do the extra work that's necessary to get the message across.
Mm-hmm.
And so we did that. I still remember that kind of required digging deep and getting a little outside of my comfort zone, because I'm not used to having to kind of create a whole mock-up in order to get the point across. But we did that, and we really got a strong nibble. And so now we're in the midst of discussions, and, that really should be more the business person's bailiwick, right? And I don't want to step in and take over and do the negotiations when that's not really my job, and I want it to be your job.
Yep.
And unfortunately, there was a lot of naivete on the part of our initial business partner, and a lot of, I think, maybe lack of understanding of how much work went into this and what we were really looking for. And so we were getting strong signals that things weren't really going well in terms of, it's sort of like the difference between the manager and the owner. You're at a restaurant and something's wrong. You want to speak to the manager, and the manager's just on the payroll, and doesn't really have skin in the game. And so, you're talking to the manager, but the manager is like, how can I get this person out of my hair? Or how can I just say whatever? Whereas if you could speak to the owner, you would get right down to brass tacks.
Totally.
And I think that was a little bit of the situation here, that the manager wasn't really as morally invested in what we were doing. For whatever reason, maybe just due to lack of experience, maybe he had thousands of other distractions, but long story short, was making representations to the venture capital company that were not, let's say, conducive to the kind of valuation we thought we deserved. So long story short, I think she was really lowballing us in order to get to a yes.
Got it. To get venture funding.
Yeah. And Fred and I were like, no, we think our valuation's a lot higher than that. And so a lot of this was, you got the angel, you got the VCs, you got a little bit of a bidding war, which is always important to have a few parties involved, but you need to be really clear on what is the valuation and what are your limits and what will you and won't you accept in terms of number and what kind of dilution and post money that will represent. And so I had already been talking with a very well-heeled friend and advisor of mine. And I distinctly remember having a conversation with him in a bar in Door County, Wisconsin, while I was up there vacationing a little bit, just kind of, bearing my soul about this. And, here's somebody who, had been in an investor with many orders of magnitude more at risk than I could have ever conceived of. So it was really generous of him to listen to my tale of woe. And, he had been following me and been really interested in what we were doing anyway. And so I kind of, told him the story about how, I felt we were being, strongly undersold. And yet, here you're also thinking with your heart about, boy, this is a friend, especially a friend of Fred's. And, I don't know what to do. I'm not sure we can just kind of dismiss this individual. But, with this sort of reinforcement that I got from that conversation and, some other trigger events that sort of indicated pretty clearly that we weren't going to get her back onto, in sort of alignment with our vision for what this should be. I mean, it's always easy to get $2 million. Is it easy to get $4-5 million? It's a different conversation. And, you can walk out of the negotiating room with a quote win, which is, yes, you got money, but you way undersold the value of this thing. So there was all this kind of negotiation in terms of what we felt we were worth and how to make that clear to the prospective investors. That involved bruising some egos all the way around, and not intentionally, but it just happened. I think that the angel was miffed and felt that he was being used as a stalking horse, and that was never ever my intent. When somebody attributes something to you that you couldn't even imagine being, then maybe you're just operating on instinct that suddenly has a name. But we were always negotiating in good faith. But we're not going to take a lowball offer when we believe in the company. And so, to make a long story short, all these things, the advice from a trusted third party, the signals that we kept getting that were indicative of being, undersold, and maybe that was an indication that maybe you didn't really believe in us, you just wanted to take the money and run. I don't know, and I don't want to waste time on that, but we finally just made the really hard decision to let her go. And that was very hard. It's hard under any circumstances, but especially when there's a, preceding friendship there, an established friendship that, is going to damage Fred's, standing, at least in the short term. I don't know, Fred, if you want to weigh in on that.
Yeah, Fred, if I want to hear this, this is a really great point, Dan, in the difficult situation that you found yourselves in, where you had a disagreement with the CEO that you hired on valuation, it sounds like.
I would say that's more of a check engine light on a much more significant structural issue. I wouldn't characterize that as, okay, we had a disagreement, therefore parted ways. I would say rather that was just one indication of many that we weren't really aligned.
Got it.
I would agree with that. And I would say that over time, Bryan, there were some red flags that were coming up, either, lack of preparation, lack of professionalism, a few other just red flags that happened along the way. And I think maybe, as you alluded to, and Dan spoke with earlier about mixing business friendships and social friendships and all that stuff, that was a significant part of the problem, because over time, it became more and more obvious we had to do something. This was not working. And in terms of Dan and my relationship, that was actually strengthening over time as we found ourselves on the same page time and time again about the way we thought about things and our approach to the business. This person was increasingly at odds with the two of us, but our problem is that how do we resolve this? Because we had this overlying friendship in place. And I think Dan is the one that finally, this valuation thing was kind of the last straw.
I would say
there had been some other issues that had happened along the way in terms of budgeting, where the business person put together a budget that was incredibly unrealistic about how much it was going to take to complete the product and get through FDA clearance. And,
under budgeting, over budgeting, obviously under budgeting, it sounds like.
Under budgeting by a factor of 5 or 10 or something, substantially under budgeting.
It'll take $600,000 to get through FDA clearance or something like that.
Well, that was the number.
You're kidding.
That was the number. And and Dan and I looked at each other and
no experience, so.
Okay. Yeah. That's, anybody could look at that who's been in the space and be like, you're right. That times 10.
And Dan and I looked at each other and said whoa, this really, because over the course of the couple of years that we'd been working on the business, I think that Dan and I had grown a lot. I mean, we had talked to a lot of people in the business. We were out there, trying to figure out as much as we can. And we were, we'd bootstrapped this obviously, and we were learning a lot. And I think when these numbers started to show up, it became more and more obvious to Dan and I that this person's growth was not at the same level as ours was.
Got it.
And then the problem became, what do we do?
Did they have equity? Let me put it out there.
Dan,
They
talk
did.
about that, because that's,
Yeah. I mean,
that was another
this is-
mistake. That was my fault.
You're right. I think that, we made some mistakes early on, not fatal errors, but mistakes about how to, apportion equity. Certainly, I want to say that a business, while we were talking earlier about, business people being somewhat, as physicians might view business people, or even engineers might view business people as being somewhat interchangeable and having roughly the same skill set. A, that's not true. And B, that skill set should be just table stakes. And you should be evaluating the person on, their particular capabilities, as well as experience, background, what they're able to bring to the party and contribute. And I think that in this particular case, one of the lessons learned was, we chose somebody who had an impressive looking resume, which is, important, but didn't have the chops or experience to work in a med device startup. All right. And so maybe had the desire, and, especially because, there's always the potential upside of being known as a founder and CEO of a successful company that has exited. Who wouldn't want that? But I can tell you from today's perspective that, if somebody approached me saying, "Hey, Dan, would you mind being CEO of this startup?" I would swallow extremely hard, and I have to look at that with really jaundiced eyes before I would think twice about, doing it. In other words, anybody who's too eager to do that is probably telling you they don't know what they're getting into. So,
yeah. And so
I think,
so this person had equity, you had to fire
Mhm.
them. And what was that conversation like? And did they want all of their equity vested?
I don't recall our particular vesting schedule, but
Yeah.
I do know that, when, fast forward to when Neuwave exited, they got a pretty nice check. So, that it was just one of those things that, you learn that don't hand out equity willy-nilly. And I think a strong corollary to that, which is something I always advise anybody who comes to me seeking advice on this particular topic, I always advise young startups not to mess up the cap table. Don't get the cap table too complicated with side deals with your uncle and your best friend from high school. I've seen lots of that, just, naive expressions of generosity that have turned into a little bit of a messier situation when big money comes around looking to, inject serious capital. If you got all these side deals and codicils, that makes it harder to sort things out. So my advice would be think carefully about giving out equity, and I know Fred and I are both on the same page about setting milestones and goals, contractual goals that have to be achieved in order to get a certain level of vesting.
Yeah, it would have made it quite a bit easier, Bryan. I mean, we had some very, very difficult conversations with this person, again, because they were a friend as well as a business partner. And around the stock, this person got a disproportionately large percentage for taking us essentially nowhere. And, luckily the prototype and all that on the engineering side had been progressing, but on the business side, we were basically at ground zero. And if we had had a vesting schedule with milestones, it would have been so much smarter, as well as having a more market-based, reason for giving people exactly a certain amount of equity.
So did you guys have a time-based equity vesting schedule, or did you just say, okay, you get 4% or 5% of the company and it's yours now? Or was there a vesting schedule and this person just ended up staying there long enough to get a decent amount of equity?
Well, that was the tragic mistake. There's two tragic mistakes. One is that there was no vesting schedule. It was founder shares, and Dan and I just said, okay, bang, here's your chunk. We didn't, again, we weren't thinking about the downsides, and it was very naive, and I take the blame for it. This was my mistake. And then the amount that we gave was very high, was way too much
from market.
That's right. And it was my fault that I didn't research the market. And I think we would have taken less of a haircut if we had known if I personally had known market rates and researched it and had a vesting schedule and had a milestone-based schedule, it would have been so much less painful. We also should have, in terms of the milestones and things, I think if we had put, certain accomplishments over certain time, it would have made the dismissal that much easier too.
Right. It would have been clear.
That's right. In this case, this person's perception was that they were doing a great job and they didn't understand what the problem was. And they were so close to a deal, and Dan and I undercut them. They were just about ready to ink a really great deal. And what were Dan and I doing getting in the way? We knew nothing about business, so you can see that it was very complex and nasty.
You're looking at the same problem in completely different ways.
Right.
That's
and
right.
You can also appreciate that, we said we hired a driver and then we're sitting in the car and we see the car going off in the ditch, and we're going to have to take the wheel. And it's like,
driving.
Wait a second, you hired me to drive the car and now you're steering?
Well, I don't want to die. So yes, that's what I'm going to do.
I think that sort of adequately captures the essence of what we're talking about. So, you see the car drifting off the road and you're like, this is a professional driver. Should we say something? And then we're getting increasingly...
stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night or something. So did you have to negotiate with this person to take lower equity than what they had originally? I mean, were they open to that, or was it like, no, all of this equity is mine, even if you're firing me?
That's right. There was no understanding.
Kind of a lot of hard feelings, and
that's
just
tough. That's tough.
It's just like, you swallow hard and you look at each other and you say, okay, this lesson learned. We had that with also with an attorney, an IP attorney who, Fred takes the blame for one thing. Well, the other IP attorney was somebody who I had known and put and done a little bit of work for. And it turned out that, while it's fine if he hires me as an expert witness, if I hire him and I'm a client of his, he had, dollar signs in his eyes, and he was very, very insistent on getting compensated at a very significant rate. And so, I think we both made character judgments about people who, the type of person we needed, and had candidates who were readily available, and didn't really fully appreciate that just because you might have had a pre-existing relationship with this person in a different sphere, that suddenly they would be, understanding of the current situation. And I think in both of those cases, we had a rude awakening that these folks weren't exactly as advertised or as you expected them to be.
Wow.
Dan, would you say the lessons that we learned were that before you bring somebody into the team, you need to do some market research to make sure you know what you're paying for, how much you're paying for it? Try to make very clear milestone-based agreements that are objective and that are easily verified. And if you're going to be bringing in somebody that especially through a social or other connection, be doubly careful.
I would say you really adequately captured it there, because having that pre-existing relationship, it's human to be kind of blinded to objectivity.
Totally. Yeah, you see your friends, and you see that, it's that, what's that bias that where you basically, somebody is good in some realm or experienced in one realm, and you apply it you look at them and say they must be good in all these other realms, or they must be morally good because they're so experienced in this realm.
Right.
And that obviously if you have prior friends,
I think that's exactly the point, is that, having an existing relationship and just not doing due diligence because, it's already, you already know this person, or you think you do, is not a substitute for, putting on the green eye shade and looking at it more objectively. But I will tell you that it's just human nature, as well as the fact that, as founders and listeners of this podcast are busy people. And when you're a busy person, you tend to have to take shortcuts because there's just not enough time in the day to do the thorough kind of vetting, to say nothing of just even finding these people, right? I mean, if you don't have a network of attorneys.
Exactly. Yep.
Then how are you going to choose an attorney?
That's right.
If you don't have a
you
network
choose
of
the
business
one that you see. If you you were in the bathroom and you stall, you found an attorney. You're like, well, it's the only attorney we know. We should call him. Sure, he does.
Just
bail
physicians.
bonds, or something. But he's an attorney, right?
Right. And I mean, I have gone from knowing, being very fearful early on in my career of getting a letter in the mail that has a law firm's address on it.
Yeah.
I've gone from that extreme to being like, there is nothing that you guys can say to me that's going to make me, shaking my boots.
Right. Yeah, that's too.
I know you guys too well now,
you've got a coat of arms now.
Well, it's just, I've seen behind the curtain. I've seen how sausage is made. So I'm okay, we're in a different sphere now. But, it's just like in medicine. I mean, there's a certain amount of stagecraft that is actually necessary for the patient to have full faith in what's going on, right? You drape a patient because, I saw a picture of a C-section the other day, and the patient's draped. She can't see what's going on, because you don't want her, she's conscious and you don't want her to see what's going on.
No,
it's not going to promote the health of the baby or the parent.
No.
So, there is a reason for stagecraft, and there is a reason to, create a sense of belief, as long as it's appropriate and can be backed up. But, that can also be very blinding to our ability to objectively conduct business.
Yeah.
And so, in many of these cases, and in the case we've been spending a lot of time talking about, we really wanted to believe. I mean, just like, we believed in each other and continue to believe in each other, you like to impart that, to everyone. I'm an extremely trusting person once, and then, you violate that trust, and it's going to be really hard for me to, regain that trust in you.
Fool me once.
Yeah. Right? Fool me once. Right. And so, but that naivete, on both our parts has served us well in certain aspects, because I think, potential investors, like to see candor. They like to see a little bit of freshness, and not a jaded investor who says, okay, this is the way it's going down and this is what you're going to give me, so I don't want to, I don't want everybody listening to this to think, oh, well, I just better, vet everybody around me to the nines until I can make a decision, because that's going to be paralysis by analysis.
Exactly.
And you can't live that way.
You can't make progress that way.
You can't make progress. You have to have a way of recovering from the inevitable mistakes that you're going to make. And that's what I think this whole thing is about.
Absolutely. And I think what I hear is, this making the decision to hire this person, could it have gone better? Sure. But the protections in place that you guys, looking back now, it's vesting. I think having a vesting schedule, whether it's milestone based or time based, really would have clarified and allowed you to course correct without taking a haircut, the way you had and going forward. But you have to make a decision. You need somebody. And,
and the way I see it, it's tuition in the school of life.
Exactly. You paid
up. You would not, you could have heard those words in B school, but they would not have meant anything to you.
That's right. It's so funny how you have to experience the actual emotion of going through the pain yourself before you're like, oh, maybe I shouldn't put my hand in the, the disposal or something, or, maybe I shouldn't lick the cold telephone pole outside like A Christmas Story or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bryan, one of the things we've been talking about, though, is serendipity on the negative side. And,
that's true.
And we've been talking about some of the downsides because, of course, humans tend to remember their mistakes really well. But I think, Dan, maybe we've had some serendipity on the positive side, too. And one of those people that we met, again, through no particular skill of our own, was Scott Button. And this is a guy who, I'm going to let Dan describe him because he's a guy you get in the trenches with. And, he's going to be, I'm in a way somewhat ashamed. I tell Scott all the time, I'm ashamed to say that I have a venture capitalist that's a friend. And this guy's earned it. And Dan maybe can discuss how we got our Series A funding and this was positive serendipity.
Yeah. I did mention
him
that Scott and I had a pre-existing relationship, and he was very interested in following what I was up to. And Venture Investors is a firm that has an office in Madison, so there is that sort of small town aspect to this whole thing. And I would like to highlight that having that proximity is an important ingredient in building long-term trust. I mean, you can call it the small town effect, but the sphere of acquaintances, at least in a town the size of Madison, is not so large that eventually what goes around isn't going to come around. You can't continue to burn bridges around here and expect to be able to raise money locally. So anyway, we persuaded Scott to on the basis, at least in part, of making our OR mock-up look sufficiently like the real thing, to have him and by extension Venture Investors agree to a valuation and an investment that I think all around would be considered to be very fair, where nobody was taking an improper haircut. And that sort of gesture of goodwill and, saying, I'm going to get in the boat with you guys and I'm going to row just as hard, give me an oar, is something that has carried forward to this day. It's not hard to find a fund that has money available, has capital to deploy. I would strongly caution, however, that capital without brains and capital without character is capital you don't want. So choose your investors wisely, because they're going to be in the boat with you and they need to be pulling at the same rate in the same direction that you want the company to go. And I would totally agree with Fred. That's one area where not only did we get a great partner, but even more fortuitously, when we had to vacate this office building that I was describing earlier, because another tenant was found and I managed to get bought out of the lease, I turned around and acquired a mixed-use building in another adjacent community to Madison, in which we ended up moving the company. And in fact, in order to keep funding the company, I sold my house and moved to the apartment above this place.
Wow.
So that was, that's basically, that sort of shopkeeper situation.
Oh my gosh.
Well,
Bryan, the company was in his basement, man.
You do what you have to do. You do what you have to do. I own this property to this day, and it's been the source of a lot of startups now. So it hasn't been a bad investment. But when venture investors was doing their due diligence, they thought, you know what, we're going to bring this other person who has a little bit of experience in medical devices, named Laura King, and at the time, her partner, also from G Medical Systems, I believe at one time at least, Richard Parmentier, I think is how you pronounce his name. Laura and Richard had formed their own little sort of consulting company to do this kind of thing. And so they came in and kind of looked us up and down. And I have a smile on my face just because I think that this is emblematic of sometimes the way Dan thinks. I like to think that this is the way I could think all the time, but in come the enemy, namely, or, you know, the people who are trying to knock us down and tell us, you know, what's wrong with our schedule and what's wrong with our concept, and, you know, poke holes, you know, like the house inspector, right? You're trying to sell the house. And the house inspector comes in and says, well, you know, this floor isn't that great. And the roof is going to need to be, you know, reshingled pretty soon. And you've got radon and, you know, all kinds of things. But, you know, we were just really impressed with how thorough Laura and Richard were. And in particular, you know, I'm thinking, Laura's pretty sharp. She really has a good head on her shoulders, despite coming from, you know, a large company. And so we turned around to venture investors and we said, you know, you guys can invest, but you're going to make her the CEO. I mean, you know, I just thought that was a little bit of jujitsu that
Wow.
I think we can take pride in that decision.
That's incredible.
And it was the right thing to do. Well, it's just like, you know, you're bringing in your own handpicked advisor, and then we turn around and say, sure, we'll embrace that.
Yeah, you used it to your own advantage.
Exactly.
And I think that might be a perfect place to stop and be ready to bring on Laura next time.
That would be awesome.
That would be perfect. So look, what I want to do is go through a brief summary of what I think we've spoken about, and you guys please edit and add as I go through. So the last things we just talked about, capital without character is capital you don't want. I'm going to use that phrase. I think that's great. Dan, choose your investors wisely because they need to be working and helping to make progress along with you. They need to be rowing in the same direction, as you said. Next, not all hires work out on a team. That's really what I wanted to get across here for our listeners is like, not every team works out and not everybody on your team is going to make it all the way to the end.
Right.
You know, and especially if you've had prior friendships is what I'm hearing here from this. So make sure everyone vests equity in a company either over time or using a milestone-based approach. It can save you a lot of heartache and money probably, you know, in the future. A lot of regret. I think on every side, you can feel more like you know what direction you're going in, and even the people you're hiring will know what they can expect.
Yeah, and I would add too to that. Just make sure that you set expectations correctly, and that, as you mentioned, not everybody is going to be with the company through the entire life of the company.
Yes.
Often it includes the founders. And
yeah, it does. Yeah.
And when Laura will tell you that, you know, she looked at Dan and I at the very beginning and was wondering, is there going to be a day when she's going to have to fire the founders?
Oh my gosh.
And luckily that didn't happen with the two of us, but it has happened in the past, and even the founders need to be ready for that possibility.
I want to hear her say that as well. And you also mentioned, I have to say this, get market rates for potential hires in terms of equity and compensation, or total compensation, we should say. That information is out there. You have to hunt for it, but it's out there. And I think that can also help you from overcompensating or undercompensating in both directions. Find advisors who are more experienced than you are. I think it sounds like, Dan, you know, really you had a good advisor in the business, on the business side, who kind of helped you come to this realization. And
yeah, if I could add just a little color to that, I would say that, you know, you have chronic and you have acute. I would characterize that person as being more of an acute advisor, which is important. And, you know, don't confuse the two, although there may be people who can do both. You know, you might need acute advice or you might need chronic advice. And those two might not be the same person or at the same time.
what I can see is that a chronic advice is somebody who probably has been in the trenches with you for a while. So they kind of know the backstory, which can be good, but it could also be bad because you can miss the big picture sometimes with that type of person.
Not only that. Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt, but
no, please.
Also the acute advisor can be a little bit more forceful when you sense that you need it.
Yeah.
You know, I'm looking for confirmation. I'm looking for confirmation that it's time to move on.
Right.
10 stakes.
Yeah.
And, you know, your chronic advisor is probably like, you know, the frog in the water that's just been
slowly boiling,
slowly boiling and not really able to add much to you when what you need is you really need to have, you know, that acute kind of situation addressed, and you need the push.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Next, make the vision crystal clear to investors. So visuals, like you did, a mock-up OR, they go a very long way. And I have told that. I think a lot of investors like shiny things. That's what I say.
Prototyping. Prototyping
yeah.
is absolutely essential to communicate the vision of the company.
And a prototype can be a visual too. I mean, you could have a design of it that looks compelling and really shows how it's going to be used in an OR setting. I think probably goes a long way for people who maybe aren't in the medical field or as experienced. They're not physicians. So you kind of have to paint the picture for them.
Well, and I would also hasten to add, and this is again the fish in water kind of situation I find myself in. As an engineer, especially on the more inventive and creative side, I'm an extremely visual thinker. And so I naturally assume that everybody else is also a visual thinker. And I encountered a student the other day who basically just straight up told me, I'm not a visual thinker. And I'm like, what? Is there such a thing?
There is.
And I just gained a huge amount of appreciation. I so appreciated her saying that, because it really reminded me, you know what? You can't assume that everybody gets these mental pictures and can flesh that out.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And the next one here, going down the line, I just want to say this one: bootstrapping or self-funding an early startup is incredibly common. I just want to tell our listeners out there, paying for it yourself early on.
Not only incredibly common, I think incredibly expected.
There you go. Incredibly expected. So even from investors, you know, you got to get the money somehow, and nobody's going to give you money early on.
You better have a lot of skin in the game before you come to me and ask me to contribute.
There you go.
I want to see the level of your commitment.
Perfect. That is very, very important to know. And then we talked about founder friends versus social friends. And I never thought about it this way, but founder friends are kind of like a marriage more than anything else. And they're built on a foundation of trust that only becomes stronger as you go along and your alignment in decision makings becomes clear. And that can lead to an amazing friendship. The reverse is kind of bringing in a social friend, and, you know, now you become business partners. It can be easy to be blinded by your social friendship, and not blinded, I don't want to use that word, but you can be biased by your social friendship, maybe to the detriment of the company at some point. And it can be hard. You don't want to ruin friendships over this social friendships.
And I'd like to add a corollary to that, which Fred will readily agree to. We licensed some technology in one aspect that involved a physician whose spouse, Fred, you know what I'm talking about, was much more controlling and interested in the, you know, that kind of exchange, then probably was warranted. So you need to be careful about that too, that, the potential partner may come with a partner of their own who is not so much a silent partner, but it can be, exerting influence in ways that are not directly beneficial to the company's future, but, that person doesn't really have any control because they're married,
The silent partner. Yeah. Or not silent.
Not so silent. Right. So, you not only have to pick your, partners carefully, but you have to look at who
Everybody.
are their influencers.
Totally. Yeah, that's important. And then finally, bringing it back to the very beginning, someone out there has the solution you need. And there was that fateful day, Dieter's thesis defense, where you two met and everything started coming together. And to me, this screams open yourself up, Fred. We talked about this, to serendipity moments. Open your chances of meeting the person who has the solution you need. And you can only do that really by networking and going out there and actively looking for these types of things to let serendipity happen. And I'm so glad it did. So we got to hear this story and you got to share this story with everybody. But I really appreciate it to both of you. I think this was very eye-opening on teams, early teams, conflict, equity, and I think we all learned a lot, and we're super excited for phase 3 on when Neuwave really started taking off like a rocket and ultimately was gobbled up.
All right.
Well, thank you both. I really appreciate your time today. It's a lot to learn from you guys, that's for sure.
Thanks, Bryan. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, rate the podcast 5 stars, and share with a friend. If you have any questions or comments, DM us at Backtable Innovation on Instagram, LinkedIn, or Twitter. Backtable Innovation is produced and hosted by Bryan Hartley,
Aaron Fritz,
and Eric Yamaker.
Our audio team lead is Kieran Gannon, with support from
Caleb Hodson,
and Ness Smith-Savadoff.
Design and digital marketing led by Brian Schmitz, with support from
Ann Dang. Social media and PR by Chi Dang.
And Dana Parker.
Thanks again for listening.
See you again next week.